Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first keynote session. It's called How Climate Tech Became Profitable. And we have with us here today Manik Suri from Therma. Manik has a whirlwind background, including work in global investment firms, in the White House, and technology to improve government, and so on. And since 2014, he has turned his attention to climate, starting Therma, which is a company that focuses on one of the most impactful sectors of climate to tackle, which is refrigeration and food waste. And Therma has had great success so far. They're deployed in many leading restaurant, retailer, and hotel chains. But today, Manik will focus on the big picture and give us an introduction to the forces that have made climate tech into the explosively growing commercial industry that it is today. Over to you, Manik. Please go ahead and share your screen.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining, and Eugene and the organizers and conference chairs. It's wonderful to see the kinds of content and folks that you've brought together. Can everyone see my screen here? Wonderful. Doing this on Zoom, you feel like 2 years into this. It should be familiar, but it's great to virtually join. Excited to speak with you all, and I wanted to start with a brief personal remark, which is that having worked on Clean Tech 1.0 and now Climate Tech, both as an investor and now as an entrepreneur, I feel like I've been living through some of the shifts in what's changed. And so I wanted to frame this up as a question and an open conversation with the group about what's different today. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk about climate tech and the marrying of profitability and sustainability. As Eugene mentioned, I run a startup called Therma based in the Bay Area. We build clean cooling solutions in the climate space. But the conversation today is really about how did climate tech become such a force from a market standpoint, such a force for capital acquisition, for business growth, and now for sector transformation. One of the frameworks that's often I've found interesting, that's often been posed is climate a math problem? And I want to challenge the question, is it a math or a marketing problem? And how do we think about this? I know that the audience today, we largely see ourselves as rationalists and empiricists, and there are a lot of data scientists here, folks that take an empirical or a data-driven view to the problem. Well, that's a very classic way to approach, the climate crisis. We have billions of tons of greenhouse gases that are being added into the atmosphere that need to be eliminated. And so many people start by talking about the climate math. How do we avoid adding additional gases into the atmosphere and causing the warming to accelerate to a point where it's untenable and unavoidable to prevent in the future? This is the typical scientific approach that people take. If you look at the UN IPCC, the kind of 1.5 degree Celsius warming limit is, I think, a great example of climate math at play. Taking an approach to reducing emissions across all sources and all drivers, and then arriving at a target and saying we cannot afford as a species to warm greater than a certain number of degrees over time. And that really is what led to the countries in the world, the vast majority, 190 plus, signing on to the Paris Agreement, and ultimately what's been driving a lot of the international efforts around warming. This 1.5 degree or less than 2 degree target is at the heart of the climate math that many companies as well as activists and governments are focused on. When you look at it from a source standpoint, if you take a math approach to the problem and you say, okay, well, the climate crisis is a math problem, then it makes sense to start by looking at, well, what are the sources of the problem? And so then one can identify, and this is from one source, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and many folks have analyzed the sources of the problem and arrived at similar stackings. Roughly 5 sectors in scale are the big drivers of emissions. And so then you can think about, okay, how do we attack these big drivers, whether it's manufacturing or the electricity grids and the electricity utilization rates, whether it's food and ag, how things move and where they move and what's used to move them, or the built environment. These are ultimately sectors that need to be attacked from the standpoint of climate math, when you look at the source of the emissions problem. And then this is an example of different ways to approach arriving at net zero. This is pathways to net zero from the White House report on climate change from a couple of years ago. The idea here around pathways is that there may be multiple ways to attack the climate problem, and there are multiple possible scenarios that we can model out. Again, everything about this approach is rational, empirical. We're using climate math as a way of thinking about the problem. How big is the problem? How much do we need to contain it? What are the big sources of the problem? And then are there ways to actually arrive at that type of solution set? And that's where the pathways come in. I worked in this modality. I worked on this type of approach for many years. Early on in my career, I joined a big investment firm called D.E. Shaw and worked on a number of technology investments, particularly around clean energy. And D.E. Shaw at the time, from 06 to 10, had a number of investments running. After that, I went to work as a junior person on the economic policy team in the Obama White House, where there were a number of efforts early on to try and make investments in and try and ultimately model out scenarios for private sector driven reduction of emissions. Those were rational empirical approaches. Here you see, different ways to transform the energy sector to reduce both the total utilization and the type of fuel sources that are used. Ultimately, additional innovation is needed to reduce the actual type of power and to change the type of power sources, and then also to decarbonize and pull carbon out of the atmosphere. These are pathways to reaching net zero. But I would argue that climate has suffered from a marketing problem. Though many of us approach it as a math problem, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is market forces respond to humans and consumers and individuals in their homes and in their families and in their communities and their actions. If individuals at that level and at the community level aren't taking the problem seriously or don't internalize the cost of the crisis, it's very hard to drive broader innovation because there aren't economic incentives. And so the reason the polar bear is up on the slide today is I think one of the things that's shifted over the past several years is that many, many innovators and many, many activists in and outside of the public and private sectors have started to approach climate as a marketing problem as well as a math problem. And that's something I wanted to focus on because I think it's important when you're approaching opportunities in the space to be thinking about what's different this time around. And that's really, I think, at the heart of so much of what's happening in the world today. I'll kind of shift over to some historical perspectives here. So when you think about clean tech 1.0 versus climate tech today, well, clean tech 1.0 was an early attempt from the mid-aughts, kind of roughly 2005, 2006, until the early teens, kind of 2010, 2011, to try and focus on aggregating capital, financial and human, to solve the climate crisis. It didn't work, as many people have written about and spoken about. A lot of ink has been spilled as to the clean tech revolution and what failed and what are the learnings. And so I think it's important to understand what happened and why now might be different. As the saying goes, if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. Well, in the clean tech 1.0 era, and I worked in this era, I worked as a young private equity investor trying to make investments in clean coal, renewable solar grids in Asia. We invested in offshore wind and a number of other technologies. Much of the clean tech wave was inspired by early innovators and early activists, folks like John Doerr, who was an early investor and someone who called attention to the climate crisis and spoke about the world he wanted his daughter to inherit, who happens to still be active in the space. I recently helped endow a climate school at Stanford, amongst other things. But one of those folks that really brought attention in the capital markets to the problem. Al Gore, who famously ran for president and went through a series of trials and tribulations in the wake of the 2000 presidential election in the US, ended up getting better known, arguably, for his documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, which caused a number of folks to start thinking about climate as a serious generational problem. And of course, you can never reduce these types of movements to just one or two individuals, but these are examples of the kinds of people that were trying to draw attention to the climate crisis. A lot of the clean tech focus was on renewables, trying to drive capital to innovate in solar and wind in particular. That's where a lot of the early venture capital and government funding in the form of grants and subsidies was focused. Part of the challenge is that the vast majority of those investments didn't work out. And half of the value that was invested, which felt like a lot of capital at the time, 25-ish billion dollars of venture capital, was lost when a number of factors drove competition into the space. There was significant investment in competing technologies coming out of China. The Chinese government in particular made huge investments in renewables and caused a lot of competition to new startup and innovators that were coming out of other geographies. They weren't able to compete with those investments and those subsidies, and ultimately the price or the green premium was significantly driven up relative to other sources of the solution. Additionally, cheap fossils and cheap natural gas in particular, as well as the input materials, caused the renewable power sources that were being innovated to become a lot more expensive relative to everything else out there. And in a market environment that was ultimately not, I would argue, driven by a fundamental approach, or kind of changing human consciousness, changing individual consumer preferences, in a purely rationalist, market force-driven approach, these factors, increasing competition, rising prices of inputs, rising prices of traditionals, made it very hard for companies to compete. And so the early clean tech innovators generally struggled to break out. One of the things that occurred as a result was that the time to liquidity or time to exit was huge, was really long. Many investors grew impatient. Many folks said, this isn't a sector we can afford to invest in. And so capital flew out of the space. And you saw a huge contraction of clean tech or climate related investing in the early 2010, 2011, 2012, kind of the early teens, so to speak. And those learnings have been distilled and internalized by many folks, both at the investment side and at the operating side. There was a huge amount of capital that was needed, large and long R&D cycles. That was something that people didn't understand at the time. And so many investors came in expecting fast and significant upside with rapid product development. They were sorely disappointed. A secondary learning, a second kind of takeaway was that you can't approach climate innovation as a government subsidized activity, or certainly not as a primarily government subsidized activity. You have to approach it from the standpoint of market competition and the ability for firm innovation to actually drive its own success. Too many companies in Clean Tech 1.0 ultimately relied on a combination of public sector grants and subsidization and lending in order to try and drive innovation curves, and never got to profitability in time. And so that was another learning. We have to actually compete on our own merits at the financial return level. A third learning was that you have to make sure that the math works from an economic standpoint. If your solutions can't compete with others out there, it's going to be very hard to drive adoption, no matter how well intentioned. And then lastly, I think there was a lot of navel gazing, so to speak, and a lot of investment community conversation around, do we really understand what we're investing in? Are we really sure that we know what the innovation curves are? There wasn't nearly as much focus around deep tech, around actually developing core competencies in the underlying technologies on the investment side. And so many of the investors were generalists, or were folks that didn't understand what they were necessarily putting capital into at the deep level. And so they had misperceptions around the time to market, the amount of capital needed. And all of those factors led to significant disappointment, overvaluation, underperformance, inability to compete, a bunch of failures. Well, what we've taken away from those learnings, I think, is a series of things. One, if you want to solve and address the climate crisis from a technology innovation standpoint, you have to ensure that you're building from deep and modern technology stacks with a coupling of technologies and market innovation. And I think what we're seeing today in the monumental growth in new technologies is that there's a fundamental approach to solving those problems with deep technology and a marrying of that deep technology focus with market incentives, with competition against other existing solutions or services. You see firms, and we'll talk about examples of how people are actually putting these solutions into practice, but you're actually seeing the utilization and knowledge sharing of the underlying technology in the marketing, in the product materials, in the way technologies are discussed with investors, in the way investors think about these investments. That's making climate tech much more accessible and, of course, more effective. And I think most importantly, there's a lot more focus around the market incentives around climate technology. I think it's important to note that climate technology today is very different. It's categorically different from clean tech 1.0. There are, hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested at this point in climate technologies, and thousands of startups over the past 8 years have been funded in the climate technology space. What we're seeing is the beginning of a massive innovation curve. I would argue that we're just at the beginning of the climate tech revolution. These are the early years when we have coming up on 100 climate tech unicorns, and that's just the beginning. And we'll talk about the scale of the problem from a market innovation standpoint. But what we're seeing is climate tech firms now are attracting capital from both mainstream investors and outperforming other stocks, outperforming other companies. And I think that's important. That's totally different from clean tech 1.0, where the majority of clean tech companies were underperforming their competitors and relying as a result on funding from other sources, not pure venture and public market. So a few things have changed, and this is really, I think, important. Sorry, just seeing in the chat here. Thanks, Eugene. We're getting some sources. There's a link to sources if anyone would like. I'm happy to share the source material for the slides or the references underlying these. But I think this is where understanding what change is important if you're an innovator. And I think everyone here who's attending this conference, who's thinking about their career and is trying to figure out where and how to help catalyze change, we're all approaching this from the standpoint of we want to be part of the solution. So I think it's important to recognize that we live in a different world today. Perhaps most importantly, I think consumer preferences and individual behavior is starting to shift. This is critical when we come back to the question of, is climate a math problem or a marketing problem? Well, if people don't care, people are apathetic or don't believe that the problem is immediate and important to solve or to take action in their personal choices, it's very hard to get firms or innovators to actually build and scale solutions. I think what we're seeing today is many more individuals are starting to consider the ecological and environmental impact of choices. That's very different from half a generation ago. Importantly, a majority of consumers are starting to buy more environmentally products than even a few years ago. That's significant. That's a sea change in the way individuals behave. In the US alone, we're seeing that there are a significant number of individuals, and arguably the vast majority of consumers, are willing to pay a premium for more sustainable products. That's important because when you have consumer shifts and individual behavior change through a combination of consciousness change, awareness building, and arguably one or another form of marketing driven solutions, that's what drives upward innovation in the industry. Secondarily, alongside consumer shifts, there's a series of regulatory and rules of the road that are changing. These are just a few to give you guys examples of what's going on out there. And many of you, I'm sure, are following the regulatory side and the legal side of the climate crisis and the solution set. I went to law school. I joke I'm a recovering attorney. You don't need to be an attorney to appreciate that the legal and regulatory environment affects individual as well as company action. And what we're seeing now through a combination of regulation and legislation and activism is more and more binding regulations and rules. For example, on energy efficiency standards and the way in which various assets, whether it's vehicles or buildings, are being assessed and being accounted for and ultimately being standardized. And those kinds of changes, the fact that we're starting to see binding policies that standardize when and how the emissions and the carbon footprint of these kinds of assets are taken into effect, that's what starts to allow firms to then make decisions. If you sell to multiple states, for example, in the US, a car or a smart building solution, when multiple jurisdictions start putting the same standards in place, it becomes a lot cheaper and a lot easier for you to sell the same product in multiple geographies. That lowers the cost of innovation, makes it more attractive to actually sell a solution, broadens your addressable market. That's the kind of impact that a regulation like that can have on an innovator or an entrepreneurial team. Another significant regulatory development is that we as a society are starting to internalize the cost of emissions and the cost of climate. One of the things that we're starting to do as a capital market innovation effort is to start requiring and pushing disclosures from the public markets on down into what and how companies are doing to both address their existing footprint and to demonstrate what their footprint is over time. So we're seeing more and more efforts, including in recent SEC proposed rule changes, which have been written about in the last several months, that would require actual action to be taken across public firms. That kind of effort has been longstanding and long going. It's taken, arguably 20 years to get that type of rule on the table. But the kind of pressure that will exert on companies is significant. If you have to actually demonstrate, if you have to first report on on the impact, whether it's your own or in your supply chain and your partners, you're now on the hook. You're now having to show up and say, hey, these are the things that my products and services are doing from a climate and emission standpoint. And then that places pressure on innovation. As the regulatory environment starts to change, it opens up a whole ecosystem for innovation, carbon accounting, reporting, standardization, investment tilting. There's a whole set of innovation that's made possible by a rule like this that would require public firms to start making disclosures around emissions, various scope emissions. I'm going to try and keep this high level, but just want to give you a feel for how these regulatory developments can drive innovation. Similarly, putting disclosures on when and how investments are being made, showing what you're doing. And the EU has been ahead in many ways of the US and other industrialized economies on pushing some of these regulatory and transparency-oriented efforts. That puts pressure not just on public companies, but also on private companies, because ultimately, what large public companies are doing affects what large private companies are planning to do, and what affects ultimately early startups, because everyone is looking at the same upstream effects. If I want to go public one day, or I want to take my company to the next level, I have to be thinking, well, what's going to happen at that next level? And that's why shifts and changes on the public market side through things like the SEC and various stock markets can affect what private firms end up doing downstream. This public market pressure has been written about a lot, and you'll see in the news every day companies coming out saying, hey, we're going to make efforts toward net zero. We're going to make investments toward reducing our scope 1, 2, or 3, or all of the above emissions. You see this having ripple effects throughout the capital markets. There are ultimately a huge set of stakeholders that are affected by these activities. Institutional investors are driving that. These are the folks that are putting huge sources of capital to work on behalf of public pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, teachers, firefighters, retirees from the Postal Service, the Army, et cetera. These large institutional investors are driving trillions of dollars of capital over time into firms, and they're making decisions that ultimately affect private innovation because they affect what the private investors, private equity, and then earlier stage venture capital start investing in. That opens up possibility for innovation. When capital is available and looking for solutions, it becomes much easier for innovators to actually go and attract that capital. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. We're seeing consumer preferences and regulatory preferences driving pressure on public market companies and public markets, which is pushing innovation efforts and enabling innovation to happen earlier and earlier stage in growth equity, in venture capital, and then of course in early stage. You see large companies that are starting to actually support regulation that opens up disclosures and requires reporting of emissions and other ESG measures that are being taken. That's really exciting because there are firms that are no longer challenging and pushing back against, but actually embracing and supporting. Those are the kinds of innovators that are going to disrupt, to use the kind of often used phrase, the establishment. They're the folks that are coming in and saying, we are so good at reducing emissions or attacking some of our ESG footprint that we want to compete on it, and we welcome the regulation, we welcome the transparency and the reporting that comes with. We think we can outcompete incumbents. I see some comments. Thanks, Eugene. Just kind of making sure nothing's addressed at me, but happy to pause at any point. And I think what you'll see, throughout this kind of presentation is it's more of a conversation, and just a few things that I wanted to share from my observations over the last 15 years, both as an investor and then working on the government side and now as an entrepreneur. I think with Clean Tech 2.0, what you'll see is that companies consistently are demonstrating outsized financial performance. That is enabling businesses and consumers to say, hey, we're making the right decision. We're not doing it because we're activists. We're not doing it because we're advocates. We're doing it because we care about profit. We care about economic outcomes. It's much easier for a venture capitalist to make a decision to invest in a company that's out competing its competitors, that's doing better, whether it's on cost of capital and capital efficiency basis, on a technology adoption basis. A lot of what's driving this, and I think this is important for the audience that's here, is rapid and fundamental improvements in technology are making it possible for climate tech solutions to compete much more aggressively and attractively than incumbents and legacy solutions. That's where innovation, that's where technology development comes in. And that's really, I think, what the opportunity is for anyone who is interested in working in the space or is working in the space today. Whether you're a data scientist or a business strategist or a product marketer or a customer support specialist, by lowering the cost of innovation, by lowering the cost of products and rapidly scaling the innovation curve using modern technologies, it is possible to actually compete head on with incumbents. And that's true across categories. We'll talk about various categories of innovation from energy to ag. That's making it a lot more attractive for investment capital to come into those companies and to scale. And because consumer preferences are changing and regulatory pressures are growing, it's making it more and more possible for these firms and these innovators to compete. And so some of the technologies that are being deployed, and I'm not going to pretend to lecture to a group of data scientists about the application of machine learning to climate. I think we can certainly talk about that and some of the kind of innovative and exciting ways in which ML and AR are being applied in the world today. But the reality is that's what bends the curve of innovation, the ability to deploy lower cost solutions and using modern technologies to make those solutions lower and lower cost. That's what led to a record number of venture-backed deals last year, for example. This creates a lot of opportunities, these trends, shifting consumer preferences, increasing government pressure, expanding transparency around reporting and accounting, lowering the cost of innovation with modern technologies, means there's a lot of opportunity today. I think it's important for everyone to recognize that there's a huge amount of work to be done. Roughly a third of the technologies that are needed to reach net zero by 2050 don't exist today. They are not yet in commercialization. They need to be developed. So if you're thinking about innovation or putting your career to work in the climate crisis, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done at a very fundamental level. There is a massive amount of R&D needed, to put it another way, to even have the technologies in the toolkit to solve the problem that we face. And that's kind of important to recognize. We don't have all the technology available today that we need. So huge amount of work to be done at the fundamental R&D level, whether that's in research labs, government offices, or deep tech startups. Secondly, there's a huge, it's hard to describe $9 trillion. It's just kind of a hard number to get your head around, I think, as a human. But the amount of capital that's going to be needed to be deployed to scale climate solutions is roughly 10x of what's being deployed today. That's just, there are thousands of companies that will need to exist at scale that don't exist today. At scale, meaning large, public, unicorn, decacorn companies. There's just a massive, massive number of companies at scale that employ or will employ hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people each that don't exist today. So lots of capital is going to be flowing into this sector. And that's because when you come back to climate as a math problem, this math problem is not going away. As a friend of mine likes to say, I didn't invent math. That's just the nature of the warming curves and the rate of innovation needed. Yeah, thanks, Eugene, for the comment. It's on a global basis, when you think about that amount of capital, it's certainly marshallable. It's certainly addressable. There's more than enough wealth. I think 300 trillion plus of wealth globally. So $10 trillion of innovation capital to save the species is arguably a drop in the bucket in terms of what human society at scale has at its disposal, the kind of wealth that we have as a species. It's still a very small sliver of that, and certainly not anywhere close to what we've been deploying on other things, like military spending, for example, at a global level. The climate problem from a gigaton emission standpoint, just using the US alone, is a daunting problem. We need multiple gigatons of CO2 emission reduction over the next 30 years, and we're just scratching the surface today. So in 2022, when your friends and you were looking at the stock market tickers and wondering, well, what's going on? Are we about to fall into a recession? Is there a bear market? Are we kind of looking at the beginning of the end? There's a lot of that in the news today. I would encourage each of you to keep a long-term view around the climate opportunity. There are huge gaps. These gaps are not going away unless we solve for them, and that creates a lot of opportunity. A number of areas where we can achieve emissions reduction. Here are a few technology stacks or technology areas that could drive significant emissions reduction. My goal here is just to give you some inspiration, not to suggest that this is the full solution set, but some of the big sectors and sources of opportunity, because they're the sources of the problem. The power grids need a huge amount of innovation. We need to invest in the fundamental infrastructure, in the way in which power is both developed and reaches people, and has a significant investment need, both at an infrastructure level, and there are a number of climate infrastructure funds and innovators that are working on transforming the grid at that level. When you take it up a level to actually transitioning from fossil to renewables, electrification is a big part of the solution. It allows us to rely on and use cleaner power than traditionals. That ultimately will drive a lot of emissions reduction. So closely related to, but distinct from the grid, is the actual drive towards, and no pun intended, the push towards electrification of assets, whether it's cars or scooters or other aspects of the built environment. We're going to need to make investments in new technology sources, and there's a lot of R&D opportunity there. Some of that, of course, is fundamental. It's not just data science. It's also chemical, material science, and work coming out of interdisciplinary efforts of physics and materials, really. The opportunity in food and ag is massive. I grew up in an ag town and saw ag firsthand. We had farms behind my house. I grew up in the Central Valley in California, a couple hours east and south of where I live in San Francisco today. Ag is one of the pillars of the global economy. I think it's been a pillar of the global economy at least since the Roman Empire. Still one of the 5 big pillars of the global economy, because everyone needs to eat. But it's a big source of the problem. Huge opportunities to deploy technologies, and not just materials and food science technologies, but also data technologies and software-enabled technologies to create visibility into new types of food sources, to create opportunity for consumers to shift and account for what and how they're eating. There's a lot of innovation needed across the production, distribution, and scaling of food across the supply chain. That and much more can be said about the food ecosystem, but you'll see a couple of examples later on in the prezo of some of the innovators in climate tech and ag. And then there's opportunity in capture and storage and next generation technologies that could actually pull carbon and gases out of the atmosphere. That's exciting from a building the future standpoint, and actually a big area where there's venture investment going, and ultimately yet another area where we don't have nearly as many technologies as we need. Just want to use a couple of examples here to give you a sense of what's possible with technology. Well, if you imagine traditional power plants using dirty power, coal and diesel and other traditionals, it's possible to keep building more and more traditional power plants. It's also possible to leverage existing assets to try and reduce the amount of power consumption that's needed by those assets. For example, you can turn the physical environment into a battery, and you can turn many aspects of the physical environment into batteries and distributed energy resources. This is, to kind of flip the metaphor, we're creating virtual power. We're not building new power, we're using the existing environment to drive more and more utilization and more effective utilization and power other assets. Lighting, for example, building lights, HVAC systems, heavy machinery. There's no reason why all of these assets need to be run dumb and run at full tilt. They can be turned into intelligent and controllable loads that can drive virtual power. That requires a lot of data science. It requires a fair bit of understanding of how assets perform. There's some simple and obvious examples. I was walking down the street in Manhattan a few weeks ago, coming out of some investor meetings. And it was late in the evening, and I remember walking down and seeing all these lights on and skyscrapers, going down, down the city. No one, of course, in the buildings. It's late at night. Everyone's, out of the offices, and the lights are on full tilt. And so that's an example of, hey, if we can reduce the load there, we can control that load and shift when and how it uses power. That opens up the possibility of giving power to other parts of the grid, creating grid flexibility and resilience. And that requires a lot of intermediary technologies. It's not as simple as turning lights off at night in skyscrapers or running refrigeration, at nighttime when it's cheaper and than when everyone's using power sources. It requires understanding assets, being able to build models off of how those assets use power, being able to interface with utilities and grid players. So there's a lot of technology that needs to be developed in order to enable something as simple or seemingly simple as virtual power. But ultimately, that's the kind of solution set. These are the kinds of solutions that are possible. Another area, just to kind of shine a light at possibility, trillion-dollar opportunity in negative emissions technologies. We see news of companies receiving interesting innovation grants, and of course, a lot of venture capital around capture and storage. I think that this is another area where you're seeing a lot of fundamental R&D and opportunity for innovation, both at the technology level and at the business level. And so when you're thinking about what kinds of opportunities there might be for you, I would just encourage you to look at examples and say, okay, what has this company done that's allowed them to marry profitability and sustainability? Thanks. I'm going to quickly skim through a few examples here, just a quick time check. Using a few examples, you've got some awesome climate tech companies out there. I'm just throwing a light at a few that are exciting and that inspired me. I think the point here with these case studies is not to suggest that these are the companies you should work at or these are the companies you should invest in. I have no relationship with any of the companies I'm sharing except the end the company I founded, Therma. I'll do a brief section on. But really, the idea here is just to shine a light. When you think about the ability to verify carbon credits, a great example of applying artificial intelligence to help expand and save forestry assets. A lot of need for creating offsets and for enabling people to actually reduce emissions in some way. Turns out that forests, who would have thought, trees are a great way to do that. But it's not just a physical planting of those trees, it's being able to understand what's actually being done in terms of the stock, the management of the stock, whether it's really being scaled, how effectively it's being grown, being able to show with data and verification that those activities are actually taking place, and then being able to build a marketplace or set of trading and transactions off of that. That's the kind of stuff that Patam is doing, using a series of technologies and bringing AI to work on forests and turning that into an exciting part of the carbon credit and carbon offset solution set. I think that's an example that's worth considering. Another example from a different part of the climate tech ecosystem is Aurora Solar, which is using modern technologies to try and change how we think about the design and the management of solar, and really using a combination of software and hardware technology stacks to start enabling much better allocation of capital around solar projects, ability to create better forecasting models, help improve the storage capacity around solar. That's something that people have been trying to do for decades, and really Aurora is using better technology to do it. And it's a combination of technology stacks. It's web applications, data science, hardware engineering, workflow management. So again, when you're looking for inspiration, check out some of the companies that are becoming category leaders in climate tech. Totally different example, but I think it's an exciting example of what's possible in climate tech. Appeel's using actual natural materials to create protective technologies that help reduce spoilage and shrink inventory loss due to food waste and spoilage. That's a massive area of opportunity in the climate crisis. Turns out that food waste, if it were a country, would be the fourth largest emitter, and that a third of all food that gets grown is thrown out every year, a third. So reducing waste by using natural ingredients and then a combination of technologies around that is enabling Apeel to say they're actually preventing tens of millions of pieces of fruit from going into the landfills around us. So that's an example of technology being deployed from the natural side and then combined with software and marketing to scale. What we're doing over at Therma is, excuse me, my mouse is kind of playing around here. What we're doing at Therma, the company I started 5 years ago, is building intelligent refrigeration and clean cooling. We're using a combination of monitoring and management to turn refrigeration assets into batteries, tapping them, reducing the waste that comes from spoilage of product, energy consumption, and refrigerant leaks. We work with companies across the food supply chain primarily in 11 countries, and we're trying to help reduce the impact of the cooling sector, which is important for human well-being. It turns out you need refrigeration for both food and pharmaceuticals. So it's growing rapidly as a sector, but there's no reason why those assets need to consume and waste energy, spoil product, and leak refrigerants. And so we're trying to use a combination of data science to build algorithms that can train equipment to perform more intelligently. And then we're using IoT-enabled monitoring to reduce waste, and web and mobile applications to make it easy and accessible to consumers and businesses around the world. So, I want to just leave you all with, a question: what's next? It's really up to everyone here to figure out. We're just at the beginning of the climate tech opportunity. Climate tech is profitable today and becoming increasingly profitable because of a series of things that have changed. The consumer preferences have shifted, and that's where I think climate as a marketing problem is important. And the regulatory environment has shifted. That also drives a lot of public and private sector pressure on innovation. And then ultimately, innovators and entrepreneurs and engineers and data scientists and product marketers are changing the technology solutions, making them cheaper, better, more affordable, more competitive, and enabling climate tech companies to actually outcompete traditionals. And that's why I think we're at the beginning of a massive wave of opportunity. What's next is really up to you. Pleasure to be here. I'm so glad to be around people that are working on this problem. I think there's no bigger problem for our generation. I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Manik, for the great presentation. I personally agree with everything you said. Basically, like, capitalism is mobilizing itself to fix climate within the limits of what capitalism can do, which is quite a lot. And I have just one question for you in the remaining minute. Basically, I know that many people who are trying to enter climate as an industry are struggling with picking which sector to work on. Like, everything you look at looks niche. It's particularly unfamiliar to people in tech who are kind of, honestly, like, we're used to having our heads in the clouds and just working with bytes, while here we need to start working with the physical world. So what would you suggest how people pick what to work on?
There's opportunity everywhere. Literally every single sector has opportunity, from manufacturing to transportation to buildings to ag. I would encourage you to find problems that motivate and animate you. Whatever that is. If you're passionate about food, there's huge opportunities in ag. If you're really interested in, the way assets get moved in the supply chain. There's huge opportunities in infrastructure in the supply chain. If you're interested in, next generation sources of energy, there's a lot of need there as well. So I would say, look at what inspires you. Look for generalist articles that tell you about some of the sources of the problem. There's great books like Speed and Scale and a number of websites that Eugene and others can direct you to. But I would say find problems that animate you, excite you, you feel passionate about, because there's literally solutions needed everywhere to solve the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Manik. I concur with that. I also want to add one thing that, like, if something looks niche to you and initially doesn't excite you, look at it anyway. Basically, like, it might look exotic, but the moment you, for example, talk to somebody who works in this industry, you'll be like, oh shit, that's so interesting. Like, I had this reaction about food waste and about refrigeration and about pretty much everything I ended up looking at. So yeah, just really talk to people and learn, and you will not be disappointed. Yeah, thank you again, Manik. See you everybody in a few minutes in our next session.
Pleasure. Thanks all.